All right. Well, with that, I will turn it over to Harsh. Let me just introduce him. Harsh Gupta Madhusudan is an India-based public markets investor with degrees in economics and business, who has written extensively on economics, finance, and politics for publications such as Mint, Swarajya, the Wall Street Journal, the Indian Express, and other publications. And so, Harsh, I will turn it over to you if you'd like to make some kind of an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you so much, Hari, for kickstarting this. Thank you to all the participants. It's my honor and privilege to be at this first of a kind virtual session. And may the gods bless all of us and this initiative. So I'll begin by a few caveats. The first and foremost being that I am not an academic. I am not an expert, actually, on anything. I don't have a PhD in anything, but definitely not religion, theology, polytheism. But I really resonate a lot with what Ed has said in his kind of two-part opening address. And I have been following his work for a long time. And I actually came to this concept through, like many of you perhaps, through my own personal life experiences, but also the way I look at the world. I really like the term that Ed used, cosmopolitical, or which I thought was very interesting, where he said that even if you do not per se believe as a polytheist, this is something that you must understand and support for its own sake, without trying to rationalize it in some way as quasi-monotheism or henotheism. I mean, we can discuss parts of that, but you must appreciate and respect that for its own sake, that kind of radical pluralism, because it perhaps might be the only way we can all live on this planet without killing each other. I mean, I always find my starting point is that, well, the world is living on the backbone of MAD, mutually assured destruction, is how we are telling ourselves that this is the way peace is being maintained. Well, yes, it is, if you have a very quote unquote rational leadership at all time. But what if you don't, right? It just takes one crazy mistake for things to blow up. And therefore it becomes really important for all of us to understand each other. And I call that global fraternity. And the biggest issue, the biggest enemy of global fraternity, of course, it has to be built on national, local fraternities. But the biggest issue with global fraternity are various kind of your run-of-the-mill universalisms. Because the average universalism is homogenizing and therefore imperialistic. And I mean, obviously, we all know about the two proselytizing Abrahamic monotheisms, but there are secular derivatives of it as well, right? I mean, in a way, some aspects of political philosophies that we saw in the 20th century did try to have a certain universal forced message, either homogeneity or hierarchy, and which led to immense violence, without going into the details, since all of us understand that well. So I wrote a book called A New Idea of India. It was, I was very fortunate, it was promoted by the Prime Minister of India. And at the end of the book, I ended up by saying that one of the humble, and I really mean it, I don't mean it just for the sake of saying it, one of the humble tasks in front of India, which is in a way the last surviving openly pluralistic polytheistic civilization, continuously surviving, is to somehow be in the background and very humbly help facilitate the revival of some kind of heterogeneous universalism. And the only heterogeneous universalism I can think of is basically what Ed very beautifully described, much more articulately than me, some kind of polytheistic international, if you want to understand of it, right? It's like Comintern, but for polytheists. And so I just started a kind of a Substack recently. I write one on economics separately. That's why to be bullish on India and all that. But I just started another Substack. I've just done one long post on it called Dharmatva, and kind of deliberately plays on the term Hindutva, which is much politicized and is kind of within a nationalistic or large tribalistic boundaries. So I try to break out of it by saying there is some universalistic heterogeneity. And I must say that the term is not important. I don't think anybody must at all identify with the term. It's just the concept. So there's no way that I'm trying to in any way trying to impose the term. But the term, what I meant by that was, if we understand that there are polytheists, and even if we are not, but so long as we genuinely respect and not just tolerate, and I think that was another point that Ed made very beautifully, that pluralism, so long as it just comes down to some refined form of sameness, is not really being really genuinely comfortable with the eccentric, the mysterious, the divine, or what might seem eccentric to some others. So I try to write many things in that, which is kind of part philosophical, part theological, but also part political and economic, given my interests. And what I write in that is, there was pre-Abrahamic proselytizing monotheisms. The world had many problems. The world in many ways is much better. At least I don't think of going back to some golden past. I do want to revive certain aspects of a golden past. Is that even when like Romans and Greeks with the Parthians and Parthians with the Indians, they were fighting on multiple things, but they were not fighting on the gods. And I must say that based on some feedback from Ed, I kind of revised some of my views. I kind of use a stylistic version of Interpretatio Graeca, Romana. I kind of may have overplayed that a bit. So I don't mean to say like these are equivalent gods. But what I meant by that point was that we could understand each other. Like we were fighting for land. We were fighting for gold. We were fighting for glory. But we were not fighting because we thought our gods are the true gods, or there is a true God, verse, and the other person is following false gods. At most, you might have said, well, my God is going to bless me, or my gods are going to bless me, and the other person's gods, we naturally assume, would bless him or her, right? So it wasn't an all-out cosmopolitical war, so to speak. It was a political war. And I think that completely changed with the arrival of proselytizing Abrahamisms. And in many ways, what I find is that amongst, of course, I'm not talking about this group of experts, amongst many, whether you want to call it Hindus, Dharmics, pagans, polytheists, whatever term we want to use, there is a very, the sense of the other person who is othering you, is not there, for good reason, precisely because of this radical pluralism that we so cherish, and it comes so naturally to us. To understand that somebody else could not think like that takes a long time to absorb. And I mean, of course, many of these great people on this panel who are now reviving within a dominant Christian or post-Christian setup, they obviously understand that very well. But for many Hindus or Dharmics in the subcontinent, it wasn't so obvious. Like, in fact, I would not say it was not fully obvious, but it wasn't so obvious. We would often call Muslim invaders Turshukas. We would refer to them still by their ethnicity. We would take their description of us as Hindus, which is again an ethnic term initially, more of a negative description that, okay, those who are not Abrahamics within this subcontinent are Hindus. And in that sense, Hindu became, no matter how much you try to run away from it, is a political term, because there is nothing called Hindu in our religious books. If we worship Shiva or Krishna, there's nothing quote unquote Hindu about it. In that sense, it's Hindu. There is nothing called a non-political Hindu. And what I meant, of course, we should be very wary of any kind of over-homogenization there. But what I really want with this Dharmatva thing, or this kind of polytheist international that Ed and Hari are kind of kicking off, is for all of us to understand that we exist for each other, that we are there. Not in any way anybody playing a big brother or in any way trying to impose our terminology even, but just to know that we exist. And even if we don't talk to each other, we just kind of see each other, kind of nod our heads. We know you exist, you know we exist. And I think that understanding is so important, because modern political philosophy might have many beautiful things. But in that triad of liberty, equality, and fraternity, they've kind of overly emphasized, modern political philosophy, liberty and equality, and kind of forgotten about fraternity. And the most organic way of having that fraternity is when you're told, as Ed again beautifully said, that you do not have to tolerate the other person. There's no kind of historicist arrogance. That you're not saying that the only reason I'll accept him or her is because at most his God corresponds to this God of mine, or underlying all these gods is still some kind of monotheism. And therefore, he is a quasi people of the book. For example, the Hanafi branch of Sunni Islam kind of exempted Hindus from death or conversion, and were kind enough to give us the option of jizya, because unlike other branches of Sunni Islam, they said, well, maybe they're kind of people of the book, kind of quasi-monotheistic. Of course, the real reason was they couldn't kill so many people at one go. But the point is, we kind of survived because we nonetheless went into that framework. Even Dara Shikoh, a very relatively quote-unquote liberal Muslim ruler who lost out to Aurangzeb, who was much more bigoted in the 17th century, he starts his book comparing Islam and Hinduism by basically saying, well, the Upanishads were kind of monotheistic. The Upanishads were the original monotheistic. And once again, I want to say that there might be non-Abrahamistic monotheisms. There's nothing wrong if somebody believes there is an underlying unity, but that need not define, as Ed rightly said, all of polytheisms. Like that need not be privileged. Let's put it that way. So my concluding point here is, we need to just begin a conversation with a lot of humility. At least me, I am learning a lot here, but understanding and giving each other confidence that we exist, and whatever damage happened in 2000 years may not be reversed in 2 decades or 2 generations. But the very fact that Ed said that if there is even one quote unquote revival, reconstruction, whatever you want to call about polytheistic pluralism in a formally Abrahamic society, it shows that no conversion is final. And in Sanskrit, we call that Satyamev Jayate, we call the truth shall win. But with the proviso that the truth is something that we're all trying to get closer to. We don't necessarily understand fully, right? So there's a Jain concept of anekantvad, multi-sidedness. But I'll leave it at that, Ed, and I can come back after the other panelists make the remarks. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for those stimulating remarks. Yes, we're going to try to we're going to try to keep people to about 7 minutes for opening statements. And so I'd like to now call on Dr. Papia Mitra, who is an associate professor at the English Department of Surendranath College for Women, Calcutta University, Kolkata, with more than 20 years of research experience and teaching. Besides degrees in English language and literature, she has a degree in the study of religion from Victoria University, Wellington, New Zealand. Her interests include religious studies, mythology and fairy tale studies, culture studies, and gender studies, and she's completed a research project on Lokayata Darshana. She has presented and published several papers on Hindu concepts of dharma and the Ramayana and Mahabharata. And so with that, Dr. Mitra.
Thank you very much. And Harsh, I enjoyed your speech very much. Okay, so I don't know how mine is going to be. The first portion is going to be a bit academic. And as an academician myself, I find it very irritating that the terms used in English, whether in academia or by ordinary people, they're always Western and monotheistic sected. That only creates confusion. Take, for example, the word idol. To a polytheist believer, the idol is the god that is present in the images, in the paintings. And of course, in Hinduism, you know that any statue cannot be a bigraho, a proper murti, unless it has been given pran pratishtha and all the rituals have been carried out. Now, to a polytheist, the gods move and live through such representations. This is because they are not confined to one dimension, that of the unseen world. They exist simultaneously in plural modes. However, the very term idol that people, including Hindus, very carelessly use when speaking in English, it is a term from Abrahamic religions, and it just means an inanimate statue which non-believers foolishly worship. Above all, it means a false god. But according to one group, these are actually devils in disguise, with shaitan or Satan set upon earth to mislead men and lead them away from the true God. And he inspires people to put up statues to attach mankind to the material world. And according to another group, having many gods means the supreme God has partners, and this image worship is a reminder of that and is even worthy of death penalty. So every time a polytheist is using the term idol, he is actually saying that his gods are false and imaginary. But he might not mean it that way, but when the discourse is in English, that association with falsity and ignorance automatically creeps in. And then there is dharma. I think very much has been told about the various facets of dharma. It is not just religion. Because just think about it, we can say that it is the dharma of water to be wet. We do not really mean that water follows any faith. We just mean it is its nature to be wet. Similarly, we have Raj Dharma, we have Kshatriya Dharma, and so on. Or even take the terms Grihastha Dharma and Shannas Dharma. If Dharma is religion, then we have the religion of the householder and religion of the sannyasi or the ascetic, which is how it is translated in many books. But that is just ridiculous. They are just different modes of life, but they're bound by the same social network. And dharma, above all, is the moral righteousness that holds the world together. And just to give an example of it, a well-known example, after the Kurukshetra war is over, Gandhari, who is the perfectly virtuous person, she's a human being, but she is perfectly virtuous. She curses Krishna, that Krishna had killed her family by deceitful means. Therefore, his family shall also be destroyed, and he himself will die a horrible death. The curse comes true. Krishna knows this and accepts it. He does not act in any way to change it because he cannot. You see, dharma would not allow it to be otherwise. Even if Krishna is God incarnate, he is accountable to man. Even an avatar must be punished if he transgresses dharma. That is why if you just translate dharma as religion, that is, it robs it of its splendor. Perhaps the closest English equivalent is righteousness. But what I'm saying is that we Hindus at any way can understand the multiplicities of the meaning of dharma in different contexts, and we use it seamlessly in our everyday language, in our mother tongues. So why not use it in English also? Because otherwise it will just get even more confusing. And also, I think polytheist scholars should be careful with how they're using the term good and evil. Because in polytheism, there is an absence of the notion of complete evil. Many gods and goddesses, they can be vindictive, they can be downright unpleasant, they can even perhaps strike down a human being to death. But there is no whole-scale corruption of the soul, so that entire mankind can be dragged down into hell and burned for eternity. But it is in monotheism, what do we have? The world is divided into pure evil and pure good, the God and his adversary. When you have that kind of mindset in the human world too, the world becomes a perpetual battleground between the armies of pure light and the armies of darkness. And certainly the twain shall never meet. Human beings can belong to one army or to the other, but never in any gray area. But in polytheism, as I said, there is no such sharp division. There are in fact no supernatural entities who attempts wholesale conversion from good to evil. In Hindu cosmology, we have Asuras, Daityas, Rakshas, and they are translated into demons in English. But again, that is very problematic for the above mentioned reason. Let us just take the case of Ravana. The Ravana is the demon, but in Ramayana, he is also a great and popular king under whom Lanka had become Golden Lanka. He is killed for his transgression of moral laws, but that does not negate his virtues. The gods and avatars also exhibit the full range of human behavior instead of only one shade. In fact, since polytheism teaches us to say good and bad is present in everyone, this means such a culture is more willing to compromise and seek peaceful resolution than mutual annihilation. Okay, and also, I have found that whether it is in academic discourse or in ordinary talk, one of the assumption is that Abrahamic religion is the norm and all polytheistic religions, whether extinct or extant, should fit into it. Even atheists, real atheists, brought up in a monotheistic culture, they think that polytheism is just a bewildering mess. But we know that the two systems are not the same. The gods are not arranged in a bureaucratic order. But even if there is a concept of supreme God, as the other two panelists before me observed, that it is different. For example, in Hinduism, we do have the concept of Brahman, the ultimate reality that lies below this phenomenal world. It is the substratum and it informs Prakriti or the material world. But this Brahman is nothing like the God of Quran and Bible, who takes an active interest in the lifestyle of their worshippers and keeps on insisting that everyone must worship them. And even the so-called great gods like Vishnu, Shiva, or Mahadev, who are worshipped by their groups, their people, I would rather say their people, as supreme godheads, they are not jealous gods. And they do not object to having other partners in their godhood. So you just cannot cleanly map one system into another. But unfortunately, I have found, and my experience is naturally limited to Hindus, that we become very apologetic and defensive when speaking about their polytheistic beliefs and gods. This is a normal reaction perhaps to the dominant culture, particularly since we have been colonized for such a long time. But we must come out of this colonized mindset. Now, I'll just give a few examples.
We might perhaps just 1 more minute or so, if you can, if you can condense. Thank you.
There are too many gods, complains the monotheist. Well, there are. The universe is filled with more wonders and terrors that the human mind can't comprehend. So say that loudly. Hinduism has been described as a jungle. So Hindus try to say, no, it is actually clear and coherent. Well, the jungle is vibrant. It is filled with all kinds of life that is ever changing and ever evolving. So yes, say it proudly. Hinduism is a jungle, never sterile, never static, with parts decaying and dying, only to be regenerated with new thoughts. Hindu gods and goddesses like Kali and Chinnamasta, they are so terrifying. So what? The gods are terrible because they manifest death as well as life. And after all, we are living in a universe that is not just made for man. There is a whole, both seen and unseen forces that are present here. So there is nothing to apologize. But if our gods, polytheistic gods, frighten the monotheists or makes them uncomfortable, but my advice to all polytheists is simply, as the slang goes, own your religion. Own your religion. It is yours. And so say it loud and clear. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'll now introduce Adam Lewis Klein. Adam Lewis Klein seeks the place where the human, animal, and God intersect at the center of the universe. He has proposed sky-earth systems science as a pluralist cosmology that generalizes central insights of polytheist and animist metaphysics. He's currently a PhD student in anthropology at McGill University, where he's studying with Eduardo Kohn. Adam is also co-director at the new independent open access journal, Oscillations, Non-Standard Experiments in Anthropology, the Social Sciences, and Cosmology, on the advisory board of which I also am pleased to serve. So I'll hand it over to you, Adam.
Great. Thank you so much, Edward, for the introduction. And it's been great already hearing everyone's really insightful comments. So in my statement, I'm going to talk a little bit about oscillations, non-standard experiments in anthropology, social sciences, and cosmology. I'm going to try and explain what our vision is, and how I think the alliance, mutual inclusion, implication with the polytheist revival movement is absolutely essential for what we're trying to do, and for how we're trying to transform the discipline of anthropology, and also, in a way, transform the discipline of humanities. I know that's a grandiose goal, and or by virtue of generalizing this cosmopolitical, this pluralist vision beyond academia. So the emblem of the cipher, I would say, for what Oscillations is doing is a symmetrical thought. And what I mean by symmetrical is that instead of treating the other thoughts, the other cosmologies, the other metaphysics, religions that we come into contact with as if they can only be understood in terms of our own system, because each system will have its own tendency to totality in some sense. We need to allow our own totality to be put into question by another totality, to allow it to be encompassed by something else. And through this is the only way, I believe, that we can actually do pluralism without simply saying it, because there are many ways in which we can speak as if, for example, moderns have spoken a lot about nature and culture. So they say there is a multiplicity of different cultures, right? And so we should respect their differences, that they see the world in various ways. However, there is an underlying nature, which the modern knows because he has access through science to this nature. And so in the last instance, the modern is always capable of encompassing these other traditions and speaking for them in the last instance. So we can diagnose these forms of absolutism as a kind of naturalism or a kind of historicism, in which the modern says all of history has been moving to the society that I live in and to the knowledge that I possess. And so polytheistic religions, indigenous religions, they only exist in some particular time frame of history, in which has passed or is in some sense inevitably going to pass. So by thinking symmetrically, we also think that we cannot ultimately separate the subjects and objects of our research. By allowing ourselves to be affected by what we study, we are always implicated on a personal level. When we try and think about other people's thinking, we have to reckon with the fact that our own thinking can be thought about in that way, through their thinking. And that affects a transformation. And so Oscillations is devoted to pushing this transformation as far as possible and seeing what happens. And so we believe that the polytheist revival movement is already doing what we're trying to do in anthropology as an academic discipline, but it's doing it in practice through living in the modern world, but not being of it, I would say. So experimenting with different ways of thinking and experiencing outside of historicism, outside of naturalism, through a real encounter with spiritual beings. And so we diagnose monotheism in a generalized sense as being this kind of lack of reciprocity, the kind of reciprocity we're looking for, and even more so than a particular religious orientation, such as Judaism, Christianity, the Abrahamic religions. We see monotheism as trying to withhold this being affected and being transformed by other thoughts and experiences. Oh, I think I lost sound.
No. I had to unmute myself. That's great. If you like, we could move on now. Were you finished with your statement?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was crackling, if I may say so myself. Um, all right, let me now move next to the participant known only as the Indic Explorer, who is a social media influencer on Clubhouse and Twitter. He has a deep interest in Indic civilizational issues from a modern perspective. He seeks to build a forum for discussion and dialogue among different international polytheists to collaborate on a global scale for mutual cooperation. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Indic Explorer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butler, and good evening to all my dearest brothers and sisters of the polytheist world. Just borrowing the opening line from Vivekananda's speech in the Chicago World Parliament of Religions. So I want to start my talk with a small story, a parable, because I feel that it is important to lay a philosophical framework or context to what we are all seeking to do today. And that is something which Harsh briefly mentioned about Anekantvad, the concept that is there in Jainism. And in that, I see a framework that polytheists worldwide could come together in. And that parable is the story of the 7 blind men and the elephant. And they've never seen an elephant. So they come to know that there is something like an elephant that is around them. And all of them touch different parts of the body of the elephant. Somebody touches the ear, they feel it, it resembles a fan. Somebody touches the tail, it resembles a snake. Somebody touches on its sides and they feel it's like a stem of a tree. And each one of them has their own conception of what the elephant is. And this is a metaphorical story of how there can be multiplicity of views of the divinity. There might be only one truth, but the way in which everyone experiences that truth would be different. And that is to say that where this framework differs from the monotheistic framework is that in a monotheistic framework, it would be exclusivist. The whole elephant is mine. In a polytheistic framework, it's aggregative. The elephant is complete when only the individual parts are strung together. It's like the different wheels of the age-old engine. They all had a common axle. There was a certain order in that chaos. So that is the kind of conception in which I feel polytheists worldwide could come together. I would speak from my personal experience, lived experience as a Hindu, because I'm no academic and I'm no expert on Hinduism, but I come from that school of thought. And I think there is a lot of synergy that we as Hindus have philosophically with polytheists worldwide, because we all worship multiple gods. We all have a lot of similar concepts with regards to time, in terms of how we look at each other as, as part of that universe. I would correct myself. I would say pluriverse or multiverse, right? There would be multiple universes which all aggregate together. There can't be one universe. It's all localized to a certain context. Think about it this way. Why would somebody living near the North Pole do a fast which breaks at sunset when they have 6 months of daylight and 6 months of darkness? So how relevant is that universalism to the land where they belong, to the people that they see around, to the animals, the flora, the fauna, the environment that is around them? How relevant is that? That is the question that we as polytheists seek to answer. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and since I opened from what Vivekananda spoke in the Parliament of World Religions, I feel polytheists need to have a body, call it what you may, a council, an association, a group where they come together, discuss their, philosophies, their religion, their culture, their histories, and also talk about their shared problems, what issues they face with aggressive proselytizing monotheisms in their land, the context in which they live, the experiences they have with colonialism. There is so much that we can share and become richer. And I think that kind of a platform is, it's urgently the need of the hour. The other thing I also want to talk about is that polytheists can actually create a mutually reinforcing network, because universalist monotheisms have a tendency to have a global platform. Polytheists end up being local, so they're never able to play globally that long game, and that can happen when they come together. As a Hindu, I would say, and of course, I do not understand other polytheistic traditions as well as I understand mine. I think Hinduism gets a raw deal in the international space. People don't understand it well enough. And I think polytheistic faiths in different areas can actually make the world far more palatable to other polytheists, not just to their own. So if somebody is living in Canada and they have seen an Inuit person practicing his indigenous tradition, when they see somebody from 6 continents away, they'll be able to at least understand that underlying philosophy, even if those rituals and practices are very different. So I think that is the way in which it's a very macro framework, which will not be easily visible to the eye, but there are great synergies that are possible. The other thing I see is that even polytheistic traditions, especially those which have lost that chain of transmission, because with indigenous traditions, the transmission of knowledge from father to son, mother to daughter, generation to generation is very important. And when that chain gets broken for whatever reason, it's important to maintain that knowledge. And I think some of the reconstructionist polytheist movements face challenges because a lot of their traditions are written by missionaries or people from other lenses, which is not doing justice to what they see about themselves, right? So I think it's important that that is explored. And if there are certain gaps, I think Hinduism as a philosophical overarching framework can give some amount of input to them, and I don't mean it in the specific sense where they are locally, but the framework, For example, if somebody wants to put up a fire altar, but they've lost that tradition of conducting a practice in a fire altar, right? How Hindus do put the clarified butter into the altar. Maybe they would not use that in the poles, they would use something else. But the way that is done, that framework, I think that Hinduism can really contribute a lot. The other thing that I feel that, there are 2-3 key issues that we need to raise as polytheists. One is, when we talk about polytheism, we stick to multiple gods, but it's also important to talk about multiple forms, because gods are worshipped in forms, in idols, in nature, in sacred groves, in places which we can touch, living and breathing places. Even gods live amongst us, right? The problem is this whole, I think there is a need to coin a term for idol phobia or idolatry or, iconoclasm. There is a requirement to call it out loud that this is not possible to normalize in popular lexicon. That needs to change. We cannot accept these kind of words which go against us, for the very principles we stand. The other thing also that I feel many polytheistic faiths face an issue with is this idea that Rajiv Malhotra talks about, fossilization. And an example to that is there is this Hindu temple complex at Mahabalipuram, right? And there is an attempt all the time for these old temples, which are part of historic, ancient kingdoms, to become museum pieces, The whole thing of making polytheistic traditions a mantelpiece in a museum, and I'm trying to use this as a metaphor here, that is something that needs to be fought, because it is a living tradition, and that is very important for us to reinforce. So till the time we only study it and critique it and deconstruct it as something from the past, we will never be able to explore it in the present and do something with it in the future. So we have to reinvent that aspect of polytheism and counter these issues that we face across whichever faith we would be, whichever gods that we would worship. And also the other thing, the last 2 points that I had to make was,
Yes,
I think,
you wrap up.
I will. So I think when recently there was an issue of mass graves of Inuit children being found in Canada, in Catholic churches, church-run schools. I think polytheists worldwide should raise these issues in their local forums. They should have a problem. When there is an issue with globalist philosophies, they always raise it on international forums. It's important that this body, whatever it would be, if it ever happens, talks about philosophies, culture, but also talks about the issues that are faced in daily lives by polytheists, so that it remains grounded to the realities. And last, I would just like to say that when your philosophy believes that you will have multiple lives, when you will come back to the planet again and again, because your time is cyclical rather than linear, you will try to leave the world a much better place than what it was when you came in. When you have only one life and then you go away, you probably would not care as much. Thank you so much. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to people for respecting the time limits. All right. Finally, I would like to introduce Dr. Pankaj Saxena, who is an author writing on art, aesthetics, Hindu architecture, history, and literature, currently working as associate professor at Rostrum School of Public Leadership. He's published more than 100 articles and research papers in various magazines and has authored 2 books, and is the director of Indic Academy Rostrum Center for Cultural Leadership. He's also visited and documented more than 1,200 ancient Hindu temples all over India. With that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, sir, for inviting me here to speak on this panel. I'm not very sure how much justice will I be able to do to this company, but I'll try in my next 7 minutes. I would like to start from today. Today is an important festival in India, in Hindu Dharma. It is called as Ahoi Ashtami. It is a festival which the current generation is not very familiar about. I will not go into much details, but the festival is deeply connected to the sense of ecology that a polytheistic religion like Hindu Dharma inculcates in its followers. The story goes about that a family around the festival of Diwali is trying to clean the house, and they are working with spades in the garden in order to clear the garden, and they accidentally hit the barrow of a porcupine. And the pups, I'm not very sure what the pups of porcupine are called, but the pups, 7 pups are killed accidentally. They don't mean it, but just by the sheer act of existing themselves in a human society, in civilization, they happen to kill these pups. The mother porcupine comes later and she wails and puts a curse upon the family, particularly the daughter who did this, that just like you killed my children, you will also not have children. So the curse is upon the daughter. Now she requests her sister-in-laws, she has 7 sisters-in-laws, that all of you have children. I don't have any children so far. So can any of you take my curse? So one of them, the youngest sister-in-law, takes upon the curse, and then she cannot have any more children. She wants more. So she consults a learned Brahmin, and he tells her that you should go and serve the holy cow. There is a particular cow, the name is Surhi, and she should serve the cow for a very long period of time. And then the curse will be lifted. So she goes, but she does not know that where to find this cow. But on her way, she's just wandering around. On her way, she finds a scene happening in nature that a snake is trying to eat a young eagle, Garuda. Now she saves this young Garuda and kills the snake. And in that way, the Garuda becomes happy on her and tells her the way to the cow. And then she goes there, she serves the cow, and the cow lifts the curse on her. So on this day, the goddess is actually the porcupine goddess. Ahoy Mata is the porcupine goddess, and you worship her. And on this day, you don't use any sharp object, any weapon. You do not even use knives. There is a certain process of holding the vrat of Vas. But the important thing is that you do not use any sharp object on this day. And on the other hand, you see that on Dashera, we worship weapons. So that's a festival which celebrates the other side of the culture, where we war with, dharmically, war with other evil and defeat them. And on the other hand, on this festival, you worship a day where you do not use any weapon or even such a sharp object. But more deeply than that, the festival is about what do you learn from it, that your actions have consequences, and that the sheer act of living, that civilization, just by the dint of existing, it destroys or disturbs nature. And you have to restore the balance somehow. So the balance is disturbed once, and then she goes on and restores the balance at some other place. So the two places, the two timelines are different, but the balance has to be restored. So this deep sense of ecology, through these festivals, through these rituals, through these customs, are inculcated in the followers of Hindu Dharma or any polytheistic religion like that. So the sense of ecology is central to it. The buzzword which we have now associated with ecology is sustainability. It's everywhere, it's all around. And the very word dharma means that which sustains. So the word sustainability is not only in the context of the articles that we use, but the principle which makes things and samsara go on for a long time in a dharmic way. So that is dharma, that is, and in a sense that all polytheistic religions followed this, this paradigm. I will just take a detour and go into prehistory just for 1 minute or two to explain a concept which we call at CCL, at the center that we teach as nature culture continuum. That when man discovered technology and new tools, and he started gaining an upper hand, he came out of the food chain. Nature has a very beautiful and inbuilt way through lakhs of years of evolution, inbuilt way of balancing things. But when man for the first time devised tools and technology and he came out of that food chain, he disturbed that balance severely. He became the top predator. In nature, everyone is at the same time the hunter and the hunted. So, and even the top predators, they can get killed with a starvation, and only a few numbers can be supported in a very large area. So in the nature, everyone is at the same time the hunter and the hunted. But for the first time, one species came out of that food chain and became the hunter and the apex predator, but no longer the hunted. So the balance of nature was very deeply disturbed. What we call as culture now, or at least what the polytheistic religions or the Hindu Dharma considers culture, is the set of human principles which seek to restore the balance that was disturbed when man came out of that food chain. So that cultural scaffolding that we use, the sets of laws, these are the rituals, customs, traditions that Dharma uses, that the polytheistic religions use all over the world. You can see it in the history of prehistory of all such places. When man first goes to Australia or any such land, at first there is a massive destruction. But then a sort of religion sets in, and these religions have arbitrary laws. Nowadays, youth cannot understand these laws and these customs are stupid. They are arbitrary. They don't make any sense. Why should you narrate a story of a porcupine losing her children? And this is also superstition, but it is about great cosmic principles that are always at play, which are not easily graspable by individuals through the exercise of rationality and logic. Because we have so much data right now. There is a paradox right now that we have so much knowledge about the destruction of ecosystems and ecology, and at the same time, we cannot stop ourselves. We keep destroying the same ecosystems. We keep destroying the same ecology. So this is an age when we have the when we have the vast amount of knowledge about the destruction that is happening all around. So much data, so much information, so much wisdom even, but we cannot stop ourselves. On the other hand, polytheistic religions or dharma sets in these traditions, customs, and rituals, which implicitly, just like a mantra, when you chant a mantra over a long period of time, it reveals its meanings to you. So a ritual, a tradition, when you practice such a dharmic ritual over a long period of time, these cosmic rhythms reveal themselves to the individual. And without even going to a university or a college, without understanding reams of paper and research papers and long thesis, you understand the great cosmic cycles and you respect that. So this is why in India, we have the word which exists in language too, and also in nature culture. Nature is called as Prakriti, and culture is called as Sanskriti. Sanskriti is, both are kriti, kriti not in the biblical sense, not the creation in the biblical sense, but the creation of the cosmic consciousness. And Sanskriti is that the same set of rules which you reinstate and refine by instituting sanskaras in individuals. And sanskaras are put into individuals by rituals, customs, and tradition that Dharma institutes. So that's why the same distinction exists in Sanskrit and Prakrit. Prakrit is the natural language, Sanskrit is the cultured language. And unlike the Judeo-Christian West, where there is a great conflict between the vernacular and the classical, the national, like they say, the grand worldview and the vernacular worldview. In India, there was never a clash between Sanskrit and Prakriti, Sanskrit and Prakrit, and what we call as Margi and Desi. Desi is the folk tradition, Margi is the classical tradition, and they both enrich each other. They both learn from each other. So dharma in this deep sense means sustainability. And sometimes it will, what is dharmic, it was what is sustainable. Sometimes these laws, these customs, these rituals might not sound good to us. And especially in a democracy, you may feel that most of its laws or many of its laws or customs, traditions might not sound appealing, but they are that which sustains. It is very easy to say that we'll give every human on this planet a microwave oven, a car, and a centrally heated house. But where are the resources going to come in, which a politician in a democracy doesn't think of, but which a polytheistic religion, which a dharmic culture like Hindu Dharma contemplates upon. So this is the kind of pluralism, because we are talking about that. It goes very deep. It just does not extend itself only to the human cultures, only to individuals. It extends like there is a fluid boundary between the divine, the human, the animal, the natural, and also the inanimate. The mountain is a god, the river is a god. So there is a very fluid context between all of these different realms. When I grew up and for the first time I read the English word supernatural, it didn't make any sense to me. What is supernatural, or how do they classify this? Because when I was growing up, there was absolutely, the gods existed just like we existed, just like the animals existed. There was, Wade Davis says this about a Colombian tribe, about the shaman, when he takes the psychedelic substance. He says that the very language that we use about these cultures is defective. We write that the shaman believes that he becomes a jaguar. He says that the shaman doesn't believe that he becomes a jaguar. The shaman actually becomes the jaguar. So that's the level of confidence that we have to exude now. We are already in a minority. Hindu Dharma is the last great national culture that is still around, apart from the Chinese folk religions. So these are the two last great cultures. There are various polytheistic traditions. So unless we exude this confidence, unless we start speaking in these terms, not thinking about what the others will think of us, whether it will be rational or scientific, that's when I think the revival will seriously start to happen. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Oh, thank you. Those remarks were very inspiring, if I can say so myself. There was a question I noticed. Someone wanted you to repeat again the name of the festival. And the goddess.
Yeah, that is Ahoi, A-H-O-I. I will write it in the comments too later on. Ahoi Ashtami. Ashtami is simply the 8th date in the Hindu calendar in every month. So it is the 8th date on the Hindu calendar, 8th Tithi. And Ahoi, A-H-O-I, is the name of the goddess, the porcupine goddess that we worship today.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, and now because everyone was so good about keeping to their time, we have a good half an hour now for some exchange and some proper dialogue in this dialogue. But all of these statements have been so rich and I mean just have really for me have really already repaid the promise of having this sort of event by the kinds of concepts that have been brought to the table, really some revolutionary ideas and some timeless ones coming together. It's exactly, I think, the kind of opening, the kind of intellectual opening that we're looking for at this event. So with that, if any of the participants would like to comment on what they heard from the others, I'll just sort of step back and adopt more of an interstitial role, so to speak. So any of the participants can speak up, including I should say unofficial participants, and anyone who's here with the ability to speak up can do so. And others, I would say, can post questions in the chat, and I will pass them along if I like them. All right.
Okay,
Yeah.
So this is a genuine question, and this is not a comment masquerading as a question. It is a question that I'm trying to understand. How do we think of humans and human civilization being quote unquote prosperous, being quote unquote modern? And there are so many connotations of these terms. They're so heavy in so many ways. And I fully agree, the word dharma, basically dharma is what sustains. How do we think about that regaining of the balance that Dr. Saxena meant, while not necessarily giving up many modern aspects of comfort, science, and technology? Or is that basically a futile attempt? And I'm not saying there is any one right answer to this, but is it necessarily the fall of Adam in the sense that we now bitten the apple, to use a monotheistic kind of concept here, or is it okay that we are evolving in terms of economics and science and technology and modern comfort? We might even go to other planets. And are we in a very kind of, are we becoming demigods? Is that something interesting? Is that something dangerous? I'm sorry, it's open-ended, but I want to understand, are we going in the right direction according to some panelists, or is this more and more falling down the cliff?
All right, is there anyone who'd like to speak to that?
Yeah, to respond to that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please, you go ahead and then I'll
go to Dr. Mitra first and then to Adam.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what I think is that nature is teaching us a good lesson, that we are not the center of the universe. Just look at the catastrophes that are happening all over the globe, and there are more to come. So that is also a kind of a dharma. The balance is being restored. And I think that is one of the things dharma has to teach us, that we are not the center of everything. We have to keep the whole world in mind. I mean, if I'm putting it maybe badly, but I'm speaking about the environmental consequences. Now that particularly we know about it, what can happen. And as for the technology part, yes, perhaps one day we might become half robot, half human beings. So let us see how far we can go in that.
Yeah, I think that we can suspend the authority that the moderns, as the people who want the prestige of being moderns, while still using their tools, as long as we think from a place that's not primarily historical. We think from an eternal place, and we think with the universe So the fact that, you know, modernity or technology or whatever we want to call it has only existed for 500 years, we can be at the scale of that and beyond it, so to speak.
We just, I see Indic Explorer has his hand raised, so I'll recognize him now.
Yeah, so there is just one observation I wanted to make about this. I think technology can also be, and in that sense, metaphorically, modernity can also be an ally in the sense, if you look sociologically, a lot of the polytheistic communities are extremely active on the digital space. And the reason that happens is because a lot of the people who are in these traditions do it out of individual passions. There are no community associations that just bring people together. They read, they understand, they discover something new, and they go deeper into it. And the digital world is actually a very good place to find people with micro interests and passions. Just generically speaking, you can meet people who have overlapping, passions that you have. So I think as far as community building part of it is concerned, I think the digital space offers a lot of opportunities. And I think philosophically, I'm not sure, probably Dr. Butler could answer that question as to how, because polytheistic faiths are so much embedded in nature, how can they create a version 2.0 which remains true to their original form, philosophically, and yet embraces technology, which in a way is already a part of our landscape in a metaphorical sense. So, yeah.
Well, I'm rather than answer that myself, I'm going to recognize Dr. Saxena, who has her hand up.
Thank you, sir. To answer to Hershey's question, whether technology is going in the right direction is a moot point, because technology, like Dr. Robert Subodh once said, is like tantra. It's a power that you can use for good or for bad. So technology in itself is neither good nor bad. Similar with nature is neither good nor bad. So technology, there is no question about technology. But one thing which we have to fundamentally change, which we cannot go on with at all, is the narrative of individual human rights. In nature, that's why all polytheistic societies, all dharmic cultures talk not about rights but duties. Because it is impossible to create a narrative of rights in which every species, every individual can be covered. The sheer mathematical probability of incorporating the rights of every species, including the microorganisms which you can't even see, is impossible. That's why dharmic cultures talk about duties. When you talk about duties, there is no clash, there is no interest groups clashing with each other, because there is a very deep sense of rit, rin, and dharm. Dharm is the way our shastras define is that by sheer act of existing, the cosmos is creating a rin, a debt on us, because the moment we are born, we are using up resources. In the context of culture, we cannot even eat ourselves, or we cannot even relieve ourselves. Our parents do it for us. So that's why when you grow up, there is a whole list of duties that you have to perform to pay back to cosmos, to pay back to your family, your clan, your nature. So this narrative of individual rights, it has to be broken. The narrative of duties has to be instilled in if we want a society, planet, which is sustainable ecologically. And there is no question of going to another planet. That very thought is adharmic, because we are talking about exhausting resources in one planet and just going to another. So that's why the word sustainability in dharmic context is not just in an item in ecology. It is a principle on which the entire edifice of a dharmic culture operates. So that principle has to be safeguarded everywhere, and that can be done with the narrative of duties and not rights. Thank you.
Okay, I would just intervene on a couple of points that have been raised, because I think I can see a kind of a thread between them. One thing that I would want to stress is because of the sheer diversity of polytheistic traditions, the origins of technology in any civilization that we can look at are from within the polytheistic substrate or ongoing milieu of that civilization. And so we don't have to think in terms of an opposition between nature and technology, with polytheistic traditions being on the side of nature alone, because these are also religions of technology, and in fact, very enthusiastically in many ways. And so that's one thing. And similarly, when we talk about a discourse about rights and a discourse about duties, now, I mean, or, a discourse about liberty, let's say, and a discourse about duties, we have to recognize that both of these sets of concepts arise from out of a polytheistic matrix as well. And so, for instance, in the Hellenic tradition, one of the most important epithets of Dionysus is the liberator, the releaser, you see, releasing all kinds of bonds of debt, for instance. And so there's a way to weave all of these kinds of different views together and recognize that we're never forced, I think, to step out of the space of these traditional discourses in order to have these kinds of conversations about liberty and duty and rights of the individual and rights toward the rights that others can claim upon us. In other words, our responsibilities to them, because we can also convert discourse about rights into the responsibilities that we have toward everyone else, human and non-human, in our social space. We have responsibilities to them. And so just to intervene in that light. Now I see Harsh has his hand up, and so I'll just recognize him. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Oluwo Olawole Olakunle, one of our fellowship recipients. I'm glad that you could join us for the latter part of the dialogue here. But let me just call for the moment on Harsh.
Thank you so much once again, Ed, and I fully echo what you just said, right? I mean, there's a lot of yin and yang. There's a lot of two sides or multiple sides, as Indic Explorer also mentioned about the Anekantwad option. I think it's very interesting. I just want to very quickly just take a minute and then I'll pass it on back to you, Ed, is that when we talk about polytheism or the radical pluralism, I think it is interesting that we should be very careful, perhaps, about not saying that polytheism says and go too concrete and specific, or dharma says and go too concrete and specific, or Hinduism or whatever. The reason is the whole point is we're defining this kind of superstructure, the way we talk about this radical pluralism, and there are a lot of multiple streams within that by definition don't necessarily agree with each other. And just to quickly answer on because my last book literally had the subtitle "Individual Rights in a Civilizational State." While I totally get Dr. Saxena's point, I think the rights versus duties thing depends on what context. So rights is in the context of a state, because this is your interface with the state, because the state very well knows how to extract the duties from you, right? Taxation, else you go to jail. Similarly, in the case of society, it is, I fully agree, much less helpful to talk about rights, much more beneficial or wholesome to talk about duties in that case, because you in society will make sure you get what is yours. It is to remind ourselves of what you are as a mother, as a father, as a son, a brother, a husband, or wife, the various kind of rin or debts in English that Dr. Saxena very beautifully spoke about. And similarly on this ecology aspect, I think it's important that we don't bottleneck ourselves. We can have different views. The reason I'm saying is if, let's say, somebody from Tesla or SpaceX, if not in this generation, next generation ends up going to Mars, we can't end up calling that as beyond the pale for our worldview, since the worldview by definition extends to the whole universe. And I think some kind of flexibility without necessarily going one way or the other in general for other views as well. And which is why I started my talk by saying, at least I see myself as being extremely open-minded and humble when I come to such a conference, and not even saying, as perhaps somebody said, but without meaning it, that Hinduism could give a framework. It could, and it may not. It might be a different framework. I'm not even sure if Hinduism's framework is only one. I think there are many frameworks within Hinduism as well. And I think it's very careful that even though we don't mean to come across as very definitive, but if we do, and if it's not about the superstructure itself or the lowest common denominator, or let's say a common minimum program of this Polytheist International, it can end up becoming too over-specific. That's my limited point in general, not just to any one specific concern.
Yeah, I think that's I think that point is well taken. When we speak about a kind of an international context or an intertraditional dialogue or framework, some kind of umbrella, we have to recognize that this has to be, in some sense, a rather emptily formal space, because the whole point is that we can't impose some kind of substantial commonality. We have to develop an experiential or a dialogical unity that's essentially about the kind of symmetry that Adam was speaking of, the kind of allowing of oneself to be affected, to be moved, as it were, in the encounter. And so in that sense, it's a difficult task to build such an umbrella for the kind of movement. But the compensation for that is that if we can build the structure for the movement, then we have, in a sense, accomplished the very goal as well, because that vehicle is the goal ultimately, simply to have a vehicle for this kind of radical cosmopolitical pluralism. And so let me just see. Pardon me, I muted myself prematurely. Adam, I see, has his hand up, and Indic has his hand up. So let me go to Adam first, and then I'll go to Indic.
Yeah, to the point of creating like a framework, right? I think that we can start with something minimal, right? And polytheism itself is already a minimal notion, right? But then we need to see how we can co-create something from that. It wouldn't be necessarily its own religion in the sense that it has doctrines or dogmas, but it would begin to construct new concepts and new formalisms that are needed in this historical moment, but insofar as we're all trying to think from that space of the eternal.
Yes, very well said. Very well said. Let me go to Indic now.
So I have a question to Harsh. And this is also in the context of the article he wrote on the dawn of Dharmatva. So there are times when, even in the past, like for example, the Egyptian faith, the polytheist faith, as well as the goddess Isis was adopted in certain parts of Greece. Also, the Persian religion of Mithra was actually adopted by the Roman elite, right? So there was a certain sense of syncretism, if I don't know, maybe if that's the right word, but yeah, syncretism, or some kind of coming together of two different traditions where they kind of co-opt each other, and imbibe certain characteristics. So I want Harsh and anyone else also, how would something like that in a polytheistic scenario, where let's say a person who is in India decides tomorrow to go somewhere, probably in the US, and he interacts with the native people there. If they want to worship the gods there and also worship Saraswati, how should different pantheons interact with each other? Like, if that has to ever happen.
No, I think that's an excellent question. I'll keep it very short because there are new participants. But absolutely, I think I briefly alluded to it, the kind of mapping and also the importance of it, but also the importance of not overstating it, the mapping or the equivalence of gods. I think, in fact, not just the beautiful examples you gave of Mithra from Persia to Rome or between Egypt and Greece, even in the northern Indian subcontinent, we had times under the Indo-Greeks and under the Kushans, where, what we now see as three separate traditions, we had Hercules, we had Buddha, and we had Vishnu, like simultaneously worshipped. We have coins on which one side is Hercules, the other side there is some Hindu god, or the other side there is Buddha. And I don't think because they did not have the experience, because we are now looking back, and there is some kind of anachronism that sets in because we are now looking back. They didn't see that as three separate religions. Just like if you go to Japan and you look at the religious census in Japan, it adds up to more than 100%, because Shinto is 70% and Buddhist is 68%. And of course, in a Western context, in an Abrahamic or post-Abrahamic context, that is absurdly silly. You can never be Catholic and Protestant simultaneously. You can never be Christian and Muslim simultaneously. So I think there is a natural, organic mingling of pantheons, as you rightly mentioned. If at all there was a fixed pantheon, some state can do that. But the relevant point is, let's say there is an NRI, there is expats, immigrants. So one example I ended that article was, at least India, which has the numbers, should the Ram Mandir that we are making in Ayodhya, using the Smarta philosophy, the Smarta way of worshipping, what is known as the Panchayat and Puja, where we have 5 gods. We choose one god to be in the center, and there are 4 kind of, not exactly subsidiary gods, but gods who we give slightly lesser importance. But that is radical pluralism. So we always worship multiple gods, not necessarily again in a henotheistic manner, but one god is our favorite god for whatever reason. And I said, obviously, the Ram Mandir has to worship Ram along with Lakshman and Sita, but why not in the corners of that temple complex have a beautiful temple of Native American gods, have a beautiful temple of the African and African diaspora gods, beautiful temple of Greco-Roman gods, beautiful temple of Australian indigenous gods. And I think that will really set that generosity if we, either in this temple or some other temple. Similarly, if we go to the US, let's say I go to New Jersey, I think it's important. This is my last point, Ed, sorry. It's important that...
I want to bring a couple more people in.
Yeah, so just my last point. I think it's important the Hindu temples in the US also start worshipping some Native American gods, because by the 2nd or 3rd generation, they are very American. And the importance of that is then nobody can, for example, ever say these polytheist reconstruction movements are alt-right, far-right, nativist, where indigenous is code for racist, because then you have that plurality. Even though you keep your tradition centered, you have on the fringes, you start accepting organically some. Ed, sorry for the delay. Over to you.
No, not at all. We'll go as long as we can. Let me bring in Dr. P. Stefanis Warius Lupus, because I think that E may have some interesting comments, especially when the topics that we've just
Yes, so thank you. As far as syncretism goes, I think one of the main things that we have to remember is that as important as it is for us to widen our own lenses and be aware that these things can happen and we can start a syncretistic practice ourselves and on our own agency, but also the deities will make it happen when they want it to happen, and that kind of we don't have to wait for them to do it, but when it kind of happens organically that way, that's, in my experience, where the most fruitful results can come, right? Because you know, we in our knowledge of, we can know about any sacred text and archaeology and things like that at the click of a few keyboard keys and hitting enter on Google. We can go, oh well, Heracles and Ram are connected because they were both people who used the bow a lot, and so that maybe makes sense. Well, if Heracles decides that he would rather syncretize with somebody else from Hindu tradition or some Native American deity, and there may not even be a completely apparent connection between them in our own minds, that tends to be where the more powerful theophany is than the comparative mythologist sitting down and going, well, this is similar to this, and then that just becomes an exercise in Jungian masturbation. So anyway, I have a lot more to say about this, but it's an important topic to me. It's something that I would have a lot more to say about. I teach a class on it, in fact. So anyway,
that was exactly the kind of intervention that I was hoping for from you. Let me just see. Maybe I'll bring in Patamasu at this point because you haven't spoken yet.
So concerning deities such as the goddess Isis and their being adopted by cultures that are outside of the native culture, something that we should be aware of today as polytheists is that our possession of our cultures, of our identities, of our languages, of individuality, these things are not necessarily significant to the gods. The gods have their own agency. The gods have their own powers, their own spheres of influence. These certainly overlap. The goddess Isis and the spread of Isis, I think, is a very significant historical point in seeing how post-Alexander, 332 BCE, that the Mediterranean world connects and explodes in its exchanges. And this very much concerns how religions and languages were influencing one another, and an entire hybrid of religions, of Egyptian religious traditions and Hellenism came about. And it is definitely demonstrated in the evidence we have that cults like the goddess Isis were able to spread because people were responding to new ideas, well, ideas that were new to them, but also deities that they recognized were choosing themselves to enter other cultures, other milieu. And so today's polytheists, I think it's important that we can see deities from other cultures being warmly welcomed into what we might think of as foreign cultures, and that the gods are choosing to do this, and that actually history gives us all of these many rich examples of how these things were peacefully done. Isn't that something that we can learn from today in order to build harmony and have peaceful dialogue?
Yes, and I mean something that I think you bring out is it's only when we stop presupposing these kinds of these kinds of identifications between gods that we can begin to appreciate, first of all, the agency of the gods themselves in establishing these actual syncretic relations, rather than seeing some underlying structure showing through. We can appreciate the discrete acts of alliance that occurred historically and the agency of the gods involved in forming these alliances rather than simply presupposing them. And so I think this is a really good example of how we enrich the entire intellectual comprehension of these cultural processes when we start to recognize the non-human agencies involved precisely as agencies. All right, now go just a few minutes longer, but I really want to have at least a 10-minute gap before the beginning of the next panel. So with that, let me see. I see Theanos Thrax. I'm going to recognize you.
Can everybody hear me? Just wanted to chime in very briefly here. One, thank everybody for all of the great dialogue so far. On the subject of going into cross-tradition syncretisms and the migration of the worship of gods from one place to another, or from one people to another, one of the things that I'm hearing us say a lot about indigenous gods and indigenous traditions. I'm not hearing anybody talk about place and the personhood of place. So I just want to name that as possibly a precursor subject, which is that when I worship gods here in Massachusetts, who are not originally worshipped here in Massachusetts, I apply the place name to their name because this is where I met them. And this is where I am worshiping them now. And so my relationship to them here is distinct to here. And further, their relationship to me is distinct to and specific to here. So if I were to go and travel internationally, I would then have to pause within my tradition, within the ritual protocols that I have, and actually determine if ritual that I was doing thousands of miles from here was to the God of this place or to the same God, but as expressing there, because that would be fundamentally bringing in a different dynamic of my relationship with that God, that deity's relationship to me, and then the synthesis through which we come together within that place. And so this becomes very relevant in questions, especially within contemporary culture and human rights subject of diaspora, of exodus, of people whose lands have been taken by way of genocide and forcible displacement. Place has personhood, which is both separate from and also intrinsically related to both people and those gods. And this really fundamentally needs to be discussed, because we're talking about, okay, individual identity, as in my individual identity, but then also the personhood of gods. But we need to factor in that third dimension, which is the personhood and agency of place. And I'll stop there because I know we're up on time.
Oh, thank you so much, though. That was a really incisive and needed intervention. All right, I see that there are other hands raised, but I think that we should break at this point. Now, everyone who is a participant in any of the panels at this conference can participate in the coming sessions, and so this dialogue continues. We're going to listen to a very stimulating panel of papers starting at 1, and there's going to be time for questions, and this dialogue, we can just keep it rolling. It can just move right through the conference as a whole. All right, so with that, we're going to adjourn for 10 minutes, and then I'll see you back here